So hello, everybody. Tom Gilb here. We're going to have a 2-hour session, if you can stand it that long. Subject is a special form of agile systems development I call value agile, because the emphasis is on delivering value to stakeholders. So we are sponsored by the SPA Specialist Group and the Quality Group. First slide, you might like to photograph it so you can at least capture the slides, but the slides are right here, gilb.com DL974, and you have almost the very, very, very latest set there in PDF. And various other connection things. I'll have a slide very similar to this as the last slide of the talk. And we are videoing this, and we will have a video up. There are already 3 videos of previous talks up at this general SPA video site on requirements, design, management, and technoscopes. That means actually 4 talks altogether. But this one will be up there too. We have another one coming next week on sustainability planning. Here's my email, tom@gilb.com, and I put in a questions welcome, so don't be shy afterwards. You have some questions, be very pleased to answer them and talk with you. So I have about 100 slides and I have about 120 minutes, and I even have some backup slides at the very, very end. If I don't get to them, you might like to peek. They're actually real case studies at a British or London bank. First, I'd like to introduce myself in the agile sense, my credibility. If I look back, when did I first do 20 incremental delivery steps of value? It was a haberdashery organization called Doblau in Oslo in 1960. I did it just intuitively, one small step at a time, make sure it was locked in, value given, and I developed and architected an entire system for my customer in about 20 value delivery steps. So that's when I started Agile. That makes a 60th anniversary, doesn't it? And I didn't learn it. I just thought it was a good idea to do a little bit at a time and make sure the thing worked. We were dealing with completely new technology that nobody had any experience with. I've been preaching Agile formally. For example, in Computer World, I had a column with over, I think, 120 or more columns called Gilb's Methodology. And that was quite fun, but somebody's picked up that in the early 70s, I started talking about Agile in a very formal way. And in fact, it was the first recorded mention of the idea. I didn't use the word Agile, of course. My friends who wrote the Agile Manifesto, people like Sutherland and Cohnbeck, Highsmith and Martin, have all kindly acknowledged that they read, for example, my book, 1988, Principles of Software Engineering Management, and picked up some ideas, and they say Tom was first. But even before that, in 1976, were you born then? Some of you probably weren't. I published a book called Software Metrics, and here's one quote from it. I'd like to read that because it's clear where I was at that point. A complex system will be most successful if it is implemented in small steps, and if each step has a clear measure of successful achievement. You'll notice that's going to be my theme all day today, as well as a retreat possibility, if it fails, to a previous successful step. In other words, you're locking in the value. You can't slip backwards upon failure. So that's about as clear a description of the Agile I'm talking about. And it's published in a book from 1976. But we were talking about it more loosely as early as I think 72 or 73 in Computer World. Kai and I have been practicing it all over the world. A lot of big name major corporations have done it at one level or another. Some, like Hewlett Packard, have done it massively throughout the corporation and published work in Hewlett Packard Journal on it. So we have a lot of published work, some of which I'll give you a peek at during this talk. and then lots and lots of books and other things. So that should establish my credibility for talking about Agile at all. I'm going to attack conventional Agile, i.e. Scrum, etc. But I'm sort of attacking my own grandchild and trying to make my grandchild behave a little bit better and be a little bit better than it currently is. Here's the Gartner group who's tried to get the history of Agile piece together, and I'm pleased to say that they must have done their research fairly reasonably, since they've got my method, the Evo method, Gilb's method, down at the root of the tree of just about practically everything that went afterwards. So was a pioneer, but I didn't know it at the time. You lucky guys, I've got a book that normally costs £1,000, but I want to give it away free for people who are generous with their help and wisdom. So there it is. That's the Agile as it should be. I have a little printed copy of it here. Right now it's just a digital book, and this is my own print of it. And basically these slides are really the book sequence and the book content. So another way of reviewing what you hear, it would be to download the book and skim through it or share it with a friend or something like that. If anybody wants to translate it to Italian or Japanese or publish it in proper paper, that's fine. Right now it's free and it's in English, and you can all have a copy almost as you listen. So there it is, tinyurl.com value agile. And you're free to distribute these to any nice, generous people, okay? This is the outline of the book, but it's also the outline of the talk. There are 4 major sections. First, we're going to look at the Agile Manifesto values, somewhat skeptically. Then I'm going to look at the Agile Manifesto principles, somewhat skeptically, but always with a positive, constructive alternative when I disagree with something. Then I have a section which is very tongue-in-cheek, so I hope nobody takes me literally, but if I were to sabotage IT projects, what would I do? And I have all these ways of sabotaging projects. Just turns out that a lot of people use these methods, not intending to sabotage their projects, but with good intent. But I'm afraid it results in failed projects, and I'd like to point that out. Finally, winding down the last fourth, if you like, of the, this is really a 2-hour version of a 1-day course, is what we've done here. I'll talk about Agile as it should be, and in fact has been since long before the Agile Manifesto. We'll talk about that later. But the main difference is that it's not a matter of iterating and incrementing, it's a matter of controlling the value stream delivery to the stakeholders. That's the key idea. And if you don't say value stream and you don't say stakeholders, you're not on the same page as I am, and I hope I can move some more people over to the main page. So who is this method for? Certainly not for everybody. If your project is so small that one man and a dog can code it in a week or so, you really don't know it. You really don't need these methods. My methods are built for serious projects and even for complex, large-scale projects. And I think a lot of what is called Agile today is really just a way of managing the coding process, making it go faster. Nothing wrong with that, but I'm afraid it doesn't include those things that are necessary for satisfying the stakeholders with value delivery. They don't even use the term. Next week, we'll be doing this sustainability planning, and that's indeed a very large project, like save the entire world within about 15 years. And you'll see we've used some of the same methods for working on that kind of project as we're going to talk about today. In other words, Agile, but very focused on these different values like poverty and hunger and health and things like that. I have a feeling like if you're really a programmer at heart and you really mainly want to code, then this talk is not for you. go code, be happy. The world needs good and better coders. But this is for people who, like project managers and up, who want to make sure that their organization gets a good deal, not a failed project, not a partially failed project, but early, frequent, measurable delivery of the things we cherish. Example with the UN Sustainability Goals, things like actually reducing poverty, actually reducing hunger, actually improving well-being, and things like this. So, and in fact, the people listening here that I hope are going to do something about it, we can call them value agile leaders. They're going to go into an organization and sell this idea and make it happen in practice on their own projects first to demonstrate how it works, and then they're going to spread it to other projects. They're going to be like a fellow you'll meet later in the talk here, Eric Simmons of Intel, who did exactly that, started more or less alone. But 20 years later, well over 20,000 Intel engineers had been trained and coached by him to successfully use the methods. That's the kind of hero I hope some of you will become, where you really do patiently over the long haul. Culture change isn't easy, but radically change and improve the environment you're working in and feel good about it. I'd like you to meet a friend of mine. My hobby has been to take him to the ballet, which we both enjoy. And I spent a whole week going on his master class about 1983. Got quite charmed by it. Now he has a little thing here, which many of you will know, plan, do, study, act cycle. There it is. And now that is an agile cycle, if you think about it or take a look at it. And we're going to see different variations of it, like my own variation. But I thought I'd point out that the idea of doing things in iterative cycles and delivering, measuring what you're doing and learning and experimenting is not a new idea. Here's from his speech in 1950 to the Japanese. He became famous for changing Japanese industrial culture at places like Toyota and Sony. And there's a Deming Prize still given, I believe, every year in Japan to the best industrial business. And here's the original of that, which is a little, it doesn't say plan, do, study, act, but it's pretty close. And there's a detail for those who like methods history. But he always referred to the master, Walter Shewhart, who taught him and Dr. Duran quality methods. And I recently managed to pull this up. So here we have the PDSA Deming that I showed you. I'm hearing a voice in the background. Voice in the background. Ah, that's my own echo. So somebody has feedback. Maybe I should turn off my own speaker or something. I don't know, I'm not sure. Anyway, so here we have Shewhart, the master, who in the 1920s taught young Duran and Deming all he knew about statistical process control and quality, and invented the Shewhart cycle that later became the Deming wheel in Japan 1950, and then the Shewhart-Deming cycle in PDSA. But the fun here is that the person who wrote this stuff here traces these ideas back to the scientific method with Galileo and Francis Bacon in 1610, 1620. We might, with Bacon, we might call it an ancient British method. And I like the word scientific method. What I'm teaching, I often call an engineering method. I don't often call it a scientific method, but it is indeed that. So I hope those who are interested in harder science and engineering for increasing the successfulness of IT projects and other kinds of projects would appreciate that they will find scientific ideas of scientific experimentation and measurement and corresponding engineering ideas in the method. But here's a nice way of starting: 1610, Shewhart, Deming, and he's my guru, Deming. Okay. So here's our cycle. Kai really developed this and wrote it down, but and we'll see it more. You could call it the Gilb value planning cycle or the EVO cycle. But here we are. We start off with stakeholders and find their values, and then we find technical solutions and decompose them. So we can do small bits of them early and frequently and deliver them to the stakeholders, maybe in an existing old system, and measure how well our solutions worked at giving the values, and learn whether our solutions are really working as well as we thought. And if they're not, we need to adjust things. And basically, you continue this cycle. I asked Deming if his cycle was eternal, and the answer is it is eternal as long as you are in competition. That is, as long as you have competitors or military adversaries. There's no end to it, because if when you finally reach the requirements you initially set, your competitors probably up the game and you have to continue in the cycle, and there is no end to it. But in theory, when you have reached the initial requirements or values you set, then you're finished with this. But that forgets the simple fact that your enemy or competitor will have upped the game by the time you've gone through a number of cycles here. Okay, so we're going to start looking at the 4 values and then the 12 principles. Basically, I'm unhappy with the whole manifesto because, in my view, it's too vague and it's too simplistic. Now, that doesn't stop people loving it because they can all make their own interpretations and it sounds nice, you know, like America First or Make America Great Again. It's amazing how many people buy into that and believe it like a religion. However, we do see a lot of failure. Basically, I think the manifesto, while good at conveying ideas that people buy into, is not good enough at conveying technology that guarantees that we're going to deliver really good value really quickly and all the time. So that's my complaint. It could have been better formulated, and I'm going to show you exactly how I would have formulated it if given a chance, but nobody invited me. Besides, if I had been invited, I'd have to compromise like everybody else at the Agile Manifesto meeting and probably agree to something silly myself. So value 1, individuals and interactions over processes and tools. Well, let's just say it's very important to get interactions with individuals like stakeholders, and very important to not overdo formal processes and tools. So let's just say at my level of interpretation, how can, you know, it's like disagreeing with what Americans call motherhood and apple pie. However, I'd put it another way. I think we need to name stakeholders, definitely not users and customers alone, as the primary sources of values. We need to expand our scope of what we listen to. We need to include things like the European Union with GDPR, which is neither a customer nor user, and get those requirements and values in there, because otherwise our system will fail to satisfy necessary laws even after we Brexit, if we want to cooperate at all with the European Union. I hate stupid bureaucracy, which is, I think, is what this is really getting at, so we agree on that. But I think there are simpler, very simple bureaucracies taking a day or an hour, which nobody can much complain about. And I think some necessary minimum bureaucracies are what we want to help us interact, not with individuals, but with groups of people and with things like laws and plans. And it's just much more, the simple reality is much more complicated. Individuals is not a good enough word, and the mere word interactions isn't the same as saying you're going to measure it very explicitly and learn from the measurement. Interactions kind of vague. So I'm not quite happy with that, and I would have written it this way. Okay. Value number 2, working software over comprehensive documentation. Now, we do agree that what the Americans did in large military systems often guided by huge formal standards, was producing hundreds to thousands of pages of bureaucracy. And quite rightly, Agile is often correctly seen as a reaction against the stupidity of a bureaucracy. But that's not the same as having no bureaucracy whatsoever. I'm a great fan of having producing about 5 pages in about 5 days, what I call a startup process. So that's the kind of minimal bureaucracy. And then after that, launching delivery increments in week 2, week 3, week 4, and onwards. So that's my necessary minimum bureaucracy. We'll talk about that more later, but in a nutshell, it quantifies the critical value objectives on Monday. It picks the top 10 or 5 powerful strategies or architectures on Tuesday. It does some estimates about side effects, costs on Wednesday. It tries to figure out how to get started next week, find some doable subsets of these strategies so you can deliver some value, and uses the 5th day to present these ideas to management, saying, can we, even though it's not our normal way of doing things, start being agile next week and the week after and prove that we can deliver. We'll talk about that more later. Here are some detailed references to it, but if you like, it's our minimum bureaucracy. So we don't believe in stupid, ridiculous bureaucracy, but we do believe in something more than zero bureaucracy and zero documentation. So now value 3, customer collaboration over contract negotiation. And again, I think this is a reaction to ridiculously large, complex contracts with lawyers just earning a lot of money for their hours. And I agree with that. However, I do believe in minimal contract frameworks, a few pages, and contract frameworks that are agile and say, if you deliver in this sequence, the following values, will pay you the following amount of money. And if you do that, we'll give you a shot at the next, call it a sprint of delivering value, and we'll pay you a certain amount of money for that. And so that's actually a very simple contract framework, doesn't require a lot of lawyers. Details are found here at flexible contracts and here. And this is very, very agile. And I think the problem the guys are fighting here is they don't really know how to do agile contracting, and they're afraid of the ridiculous American Department of Defense, USA contracting practices. We all should be very afraid of them. But there are better options where we negotiate the contract on each and every agile delivery step, and we don't collaborate with the customer. We cooperate with the stakeholders. The word collaboration has a very nasty taste to it in Norway and other Nazi-occupied countries, because it actually means actively helping the enemy. Since America wasn't occupied, the Americans don't mind using that word, but look it up in the dictionary. It very much says, you know, nasty. It's a nasty word and isn't a good one. Cooperation might be a lot better. Stakeholder cooperation, including contractual negotiation, every agile step is what I'd like to do. So second point here, there's another form of collaboration. My model of it is IBM Federal Systems Division clean room method, documentation here and here, where again, they're actually doing what I'm talking about here. They have a framework contract with a fixed date and a fixed price, and they were lowest bidder. And then they divide the project into about 40, 50 incremental steps of value delivery, and they learn. They're not necessarily doing the contractual thing at each step, because that wasn't built into the contract, which is what I'm suggesting here. We should build in the contract, but they are delivering measurable value like enhanced availability, and they are, if necessary, doing dynamic design to cost, I call it. That is, at each step, they're asking, do we need to improve the design so as to reduce the future costs and enhance the value delivery? And so that's I've talked about this earlier in my earlier lectures. So again, I think this is superior to this vague idea. It's superior because they report that they always deliver on time, under budget, to the highest state-of-the-art quality levels for the largest and most complex military and space projects of their day. So you can't beat that as a method, and nothing in Agile has ever approached that success level. So in other words, there's another alternative. It's not customer collaboration. It is step-by-step measuring and reacting to the measures. In other words, a good engineering method, a good scientific method. Value number 4, responding to change over following a plan. Well, let's see. Does that mean you just start coding and you respond to whether there are too many bugs in the use case you coded? I believe there should be a plan, and I believe that plan should be reach your top 10 critical objectives. These are symbolic for a set of critical objectives for the sustainability planning we're going to talk about next week. And in other words, the minimum plan needs to be a page where the top 10 critical objectives of your stakeholders are defined and quantified with scales of measure and levels we have to attain. And that's the plan. And everything revolves about answering the question, are we week by week, month by month, step by step, moving towards achieving that plan? If that's the only plan you need. The plan of how good we have to be with values, and the fact that we got to keep our eye on whether we're moving towards those values or not. And that plan can be made in a day, and it's a one-page plan, and I don't think it's going to overwhelm anybody. And it's not a static plan. You can change the numbers as you learn and use the updated numbers and definitions of things to guide your path at any point here. So it's not a static plan, but it is small, simple, and guides us to what we're going to do on every step. So I don't know how you intelligently can respond to change if you have no plan whatsoever. Sounds pretty arbitrary to me, but a minimum plan of what really counts, the values of the stakeholders, that's the plan. And the plan is to check, are we reaching that plan at each and every step? And that's Agile. So done with the values. Hope you got some potential ideas there. I realize all of them might need more study. That's why there are plenty of references to more detail. And all the earlier courses and lectures I've held do give more detail on things like quantifying the values and things like that. So here we have the principles, and I have long since looked at the principles and made proposals for improving them. But I'm going to do it again here. Again, nice kind of motherhood idea, satisfy the customer, very good until you realize the literal customer isn't anywhere near as good as the stakeholder, etc. So there's a lot of management bullshit here, political bullshit. Everybody likes it because they interpret it in their own particular way, but these are not strong guides to how to really get and do successful projects. So now, I like principles, I love them, and there's a lovely quote from Harrington Emerson. As to methods, there may be a million, and you saw that large chart of all the Agile methods, and that's not a complete chart, but principles are few. Maybe there are only 12 of them for Agile, and there are only 12 principles of efficiency here. The person who grasps principles can successfully select their own methods. So we need really good principles in order to decide which Agile methods are suitable for you. And I'm not saying there's just one set of Agile methods and they're mine. I'm saying there are some principles for selecting Agile methods, and you should use them to find your own set. I love principles. In 1988, I wrote a book, very much a book about Agile. I had approximately 144 principles in the book. So definitely love my principles. I have a little question down here, very tongue-in-cheek. Do principles trump methods? I'll leave you to think about that. I've crossed it out. Number one principle, here it says, our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. Now, if by customer they really mean stakeholder, I can't disagree. That's our highest priority. But they don't. They don't understand stakeholder. They don't say stakeholder. Mature environments, such as any systems engineering environment doing, say, military or space work, they don't talk about customers. They talk about stakeholders. There are many of them, and it's far more complex than customer. So the mere mention of user or customer is a sign of small-scale lack of maturity. Okay. We need to grow up a little bit and recognize that for the most part, our IT systems have a large number of stakeholders, one of whom is perhaps the customer who pays, another of whom is perhaps the user who uses, and 48 other stakeholders are something different, but those stakeholders have values and they have power as critical stakeholders to demand that some of those values are delivered by us. Otherwise, they will shout foul and fail, and our systems will fail. Now, continuous delivery of valuable software. I'm sure that programmers think that the only thing in the world is delivery of software, but most stakeholders couldn't care less if any software is delivered at all, as long as their values are delivered to them. And there are lots of ways, even in IT systems, of delivering values, even if no code is written and no software is delivered. I leave that to your imagination to realize that IT is much bigger than code. But unfortunately, most of my friends who wrote the Agile Manifesto are coders at heart, and to this day, they're very clear about it. I just want to code. I don't want to know about that Agile stuff, says a guy like Kent Beck, and that's fine. We need coders who love coding and do a good job at it, but coding is not enough to satisfy the stakeholders and make successful systems. So we need somebody to work at another level who doesn't want to just code no matter what. So here's what I call my constructive reformulation. Development efforts should attempt to deliver measurably and cost effectively a well-defined set of prioritized, meaning the critical things that you have to do, stakeholder, not just customer or user, value levels as early as possible. So I like early and I like continuous delivery and I like valuable. It's the software bit and the customer bit that really turned me off. Principle number 2. We welcome changing requirements, even late in development, and we need to harness change for the customer's competitive advantage. Well, that's always good management bullshit, that competitive advantage thing. I've rewritten it here, but again, yes, we need to deal with changing requirements. Now, my problem is if you look at my requirements, look at the value requirements course I held a few weeks ago, you'll find that they're very, very different from the requirements that these people are talking about. These people, which include my friend Mike Cohn, have things like user stories, which are a very small fraction of what I call requirements, to put it mildly. So in other words, for example, my requirements would have a lot more information about risks and issues and relationships and stakeholders and justifications and a lot of other things. As you can see from looking at any example of my requirements or the competitive engineering book, for example. Again, you get questions like, if we changed and brought in a new major stakeholder, say the World Health Organization, that might not be even mentioned in the requirements of people who do more primitive requirements like user stories. And so there wouldn't be any change there because they're not even mentioned. But in my requirements, there would be a change. And the question is, are we going to exploit the fact that we have a new stakeholder with perhaps different levels of the quality needed by a different time because of the coronavirus? Okay. In other words, we have a problem here. Even we don't have a simple common understanding what requirements are. I have a thing called value requirements using language, which is radically different and I hope better, at least richer for large, more complex systems than things at the level of user stories, which are a very good idea for simpler systems and not enough ideas for larger and more complex systems. So the whole idea of change when you haven't even got a shared idea what requirements are is pretty difficult. Anyway, long story short, we definitely need ways to discover and incorporate changes in any of the many stakeholders' requirements as soon as possible. We agree on the principle, not on the detail. And we need to understand the priority of these changes. And we're not very good at that in conventional thinking, but I have a lot of tools for dealing with that. And we need to understand consequences, for example, to all the other stakeholders, which these guys who are writing this don't even recognize the existence of all the stakeholders. They just have their customer and user. We need to understand the consequence to any planned architecture. And these guys don't even mention architecture or design. That just sort of emerges magically as you code. And not to mention all the project plans, which they don't want to know about. They'd rather just get coding and contract, etc. So in other words, in a simplified world, no problem. In the world of building a national health system, IT system, to take a simple example, we need to think bigger, think more comprehensively, think more rigorously. And this is about the simplest statement I'd make there. Principle number 3, deliver working software frequently from a couple of weeks to a couple of months with a preference for the shorter time scale. Now, I absolutely agree on delivering in shorter time scales. I love weekly increments. I'll stomach something like a couple. So we very much agree on the nature of the cycle. We're not, although notice that lean methods sometimes have 50 different deliveries per day. So that's a very short cycle. But forget them for the moment. Certainly, we have too many large projects, like large government projects, that beaver away for years and start delivering years later, or not at all with total failure. So that's what they're reacting to, is we need to have, this year, this month, some action. And we agree on that. In fact, I think that's the idea they claim to have picked up from my writings, that we should have something like weekly increments. Now, deliver working software. Of course, the software should not be working, but I don't think that's the delivery. I completely disagree. What we need to deliver is what I loosely call designs or solutions. And the definition of designs or solutions is when you deliver them, you get values like high. Unmuted. Okay, I got a message about getting my microphone back here. I hope it's working.
Sorry, Tom, I was trying to mute somebody else and I missed the button.
Oh, okay. You hit me accidentally. Okay, we're back. And I can hear you much better, Imo. Whatever happened with your Mac, it's now working. Yeah, that's good. Okay, so in other words, there are lots of ways of delivering value without delivering any software at all. For example, you could motivate the organization to do things better. You could train them to do things better. You could do things with your database to make things better. You could do things with your hardware to make things better. There just is, in IT, there is no necessity of simply delivering working software as the only thing. So this is just tuner. Again, this is the mind of a programmer thinking that the only thing that counts in life is delivering code. And I strongly disagree. I think would they please go and have a, let's call it Agile for coders, okay? But Agile for IT people, Agile for systems people needs to think obviously at a higher level than merely software. So here's my constructive reformulation, that what we need to deliver is improvement of value, okay? And that means we need to deliver any design or architecture or tactic or magic that in fact enhances the value. And if that be software, so be it. But if it not be software, don't deliver software instead of what you need to deliver the value. That's silly, okay? Here's a lovely little practical example from Philips of Holland, where they're actually building a machine that puts components on electronics boards, and what they're trying to do is lengthen the successful runs. And I suggested to the project manager, Frank, that they should do this using evolutionary feedback. Now, this is their primary value we're talking about here. And he'd been stymied and stuck and couldn't get anything going. And I said, you need to divide your project up into evolutionary steps, take one step at a time. And originally everybody said this couldn't be done, but we worked on the problem, and Frank was very cooperative, and he did what I advised, and he cracked it and started week by week getting delivery of longer and longer successful runs. There's a big difference between 3 and 50. And that blew everybody's mind. Nobody at Philips, Frank hoped for it. His director said it can't be done, but we successfully did deliver the value week by week, measurably, okay? And by doing something, whatever magic, I don't care. And there's a memorable event where everybody applauded Frank in public, including his director, saying that we didn't believe this was possible, but it was, and now we've begun to crack our problems. Principle 4, now business people and developers must work together daily throughout the project. Now, I like cooperation as opposed to non-cooperation. So if you, okay, but for example, business people and developers, let me put it another way. Developers, especially business analysts, not coders, okay, need to cooperate in some way. That doesn't mean standing together chatting, with all the stakeholders as far as they can. Okay, so what I don't like about this is they're saying business people instead of stakeholders, so far too narrow. There's a danger of forgetting 40 really important and critical stakeholders who are not business people and not developers, but they're very important, and we need to understand what they want, and we need to, and working together in the loosest sense of the word, okay, but it means cooperate. What we really need to say is cooperate and communicate. And whether we do it daily or not, I don't know. I think weekly might be sufficient, continuously might be sufficient. So this is a little bit strong. But here's my reformulation, right? All parties to a development effort, the stakeholders, need to have a voice for their interests, the requirements about their values, and an insight into the effort, of what can impact them, including other stakeholders' needs can impact them. Let's call it side effects, on a continuous basis, not necessarily daily, but weekly would be great. And this needs to get into the operations and decommissioning of a system, which doesn't sound like developers at all. Okay, so in other words, again, narrow, and we need something better to really tackle the larger, more complex systems. Principle 5, build projects around motivated individuals. Yeah, give them the environment and support they need and trust them to get the job done. Now, I'm big on delegation of authority to programmers, and to the grassroots. So that's fine. It's very important that people have an environment where they are trusted and can make decisions. So we agree on that. Probably should say their need here. Sorry for the typo. And people need to be motivated. I think the motivation people need is the motivation to drive towards the critical high priority objectives, the values. And I think they need to be given the freedom to find ways to get negative feedback which says, you're not going there, it costs too much, you're not delivering the value, and what are you going to do about it right here and now? Agree on that. But they need to find the most cost-effective solutions. Let's call this, there's somewhere between the architect and the development team making design decisions at different levels, need to constantly tune in and say, are we really moving towards those critical values at a rate consistent with reaching them by the big deadline in the sky? And are we really doing it in a cost-effective way? Or are we, because you could be moving ahead, but at 10 times the cost, which is not a good idea. So we need to manage all those things. So stakeholders and developers need to be motivated, but towards cost effectiveness, okay? So I agree with a bit of this, but I would rather reformulate it. Principle number 6, enable face-to-face interactions. Well, as we've begun to learn through our digital interactions and our Zooms and things like that, nothing beats face-to-face in certain circumstances. So I very much agree with that. But face-to-face is the intent here is to get really good communication, clear communication. Now, I believe that people talking to each other in a stand-up meeting is a very bad way of communicating about complex things like 50 stakeholders. How do you talk about that at a stand-up meeting? You don't. How do you talk about 10 quantified critical requirements at a stand-up meeting? And the answer is you don't. So I don't think face-to-face is okay for very simple and small systems, okay? But the problem is we have some really large, medium to extremely large systems, and face-to-face, to a degree, yes, talk to each other, but above all, we actually need written communication. There's a point where writing is the best vehicle for communicating a set of very complex ideas about an IT systems. There's a reason why humans use writing, okay? And that doesn't mean no face-to-face. It just means not like this is the most important thing in the world as we talk to each other all the time. Talking orally has severe limitations when it comes to expressing complex requirements or designs or stakeholders, okay? We need to put all the information about our systems in a project database and systematically collect it, making that database available for all developers and stakeholders and anybody who needs to look at the information. And again, face-to-face doesn't solve the problem of being able to go into a database and say, I need to know everything impacting the security value and these 3 stakeholders. You need to have that stuff in a database in a clear language, and you need to continuously update it, and you need to make it available to appropriate people. All these things, like all the requirements, the design, the economics, i.e. the cost, the time, the constraints, the risks, the issues, the dependencies, the prioritizations. And people are pretty bad at discussing those things at all, let alone orally in face-to-face. We need a written, well-defined format so we can communicate, just like any engineering or scientific process does not primarily rely on face-to-face. But there's a time and a place for going face-to-face, but maybe as with this database of the complexity of the project as a basis for the face-to-face discussion. And that's something we're not very good at. Principle 7, working software is the primary measure of progress. I get really angry at this. Moving towards the values, the value levels for security, usability, transparency, whatever that the stakeholders need. That's the primary measure of progress on a project. Working software, which I take to mean has the right functions, does what the use case or user story says, and has little or no bugs in it, that is not a primary measure of progress. You can deliver working software with no value, okay? There are other things you can deliver except working software, and I've already discussed this, which do deliver value, so this is just dead wrong. So my reformulation, the primary measure of development progress is the degree of actual stakeholder delivered, they've got it in their hands, planned, there's an agreement in advance and it's official, value levels with respect to planned resources. In other words, without exceeding your budget or deadlines by a factor of 10. Okay, so we need to reformulate this totally. Again, from a programmer's point of view, in a small project, this principle is probably fine. But if you're going to scale up and do really demanding projects, then we need to go to this level of thinking. Principle number 8. It says here, agile processes promote sustainable development. Wow. If we go agile, then the United Nations goals will all be met, it says here, because that's what sustainable development means to some people. I haven't seen the research on which agile processes promote sustainable development. I haven't even seen really good definitions, measurable definitions of what sustainable development is for most people. They can't even define technical debt quantitatively. I can't, by the way. We'll look at it later. So this is just blah, blah, blah. This is just a bland assertion of some understanding here. And maybe at some level, for some interpretations, this makes sense to whoever said it. But there is no proof that this is a general truth. And I think sustainable development is done primarily by designing the systems to be sustainable, whether you use agile processes or not. I don't think agile processes are primary in getting sustainable development. But what they're trying to say is, if we take small cycles and get feedback, we're not going to burn ourselves out and go crazy with too much work attaining nothing. So at the level, in the context this was said, I think I understand what they're getting at, but it's a dangerous overgeneralization. They're interested in this constant pace of work, so people aren't working weekends and get a work-life balance, and we definitely agree with that. I believe that if you deliver real value to your stakeholders measurably on the second week and every week of the project, like my friends at Confirm It, who will do, then you will have a sustainable pace of development, okay? And that's with my Agile. But I think other Agile processes, which are not necessarily delivering the measurable value, they're just delivering code, are not going to achieve that, okay? So again, here's my constructive reformulation. I think there is a very wide variety of strategies which lead to a better working environment. Here's an example at IBM in Minnesota implementing in a 30-month period 2,162 improvements to their working environment. That says, and I don't think all of those were Agile. Maybe none of them were Agile. So there's just an awful lot of stuff you can do to make a better working environment. There's a process known as defect prevention process. I've talked about it a little bit before, and there's more on it here. This is the most effective process that has a track record of actually making a much better working environment, working at a constant pace and delivering results. So if I had to put in one thing that promotes sustainable environment, I'd say the defect prevention process has a clearer, recorded, credible track record than any Agile process such as Scrum or SAFe has in giving the environment. show me the research on which agile processes lead to exactly what, because I don't know what they're talking about. And we'll compare it with what they, for example, have achieved at Raytheon, IBM, and other places with these methods. So again, here's my reformulation. Let's open it up for anybody who can actually give us a constant pace and not say that Agile is the needs bees and solves all problems with a silver bullet. And we agree that reasonable workload for developers and other stakeholders is a healthy ideal. People should have a family and should have a life. But if you narrowly declare agile processes will do it, I don't think so. And I think we'll find plenty of so-called agile environments that are working people to death. I think it's easy enough to find this on the web as case studies. So enough of that. Principle number 9. Continuous attention to technical excellence and good design enhances agility. Oh my God. Now, at first, you'd think that agility was the thing we wanted to enhance, that agility is the needs bees. And agility is, now, fact is, agility, if it helps us deliver better value, then I'm all for agility. If there are other better ways to deliver value, such as designing the values in without using agility at all, I don't need agility. So this is putting agility on too high a level. Who cares whether we enhance agility or not? We want to enhance the value to the stakeholders. Let's get that straight. We've got to stop putting agility in the center. We've got to put value in the center. And now, good design, what's that? Well, for some people, it's amazing what it means, but it doesn't mean designs which enhance the values, like the transparency and privacy and usability of the system. It means whatever mystical architects do without having any good, clear requirements. And I've talked about that earlier. So I think we need a clear, shared understanding of good design. My understanding of good design, as I've talked about earlier, is that all the various designs actually contribute to my various goals numerically. That's a definition of good design. Good design delivers the values within our cost constraints. And that definition is not something the people who wrote this were thinking about at all. They don't even think about it today. They hardly know what it is. So we're just not, we don't have a shared definition of good design. They're thinking of good code design, and I'm thinking of good systems design, and good design in the sense of delivering the values, whatever we do. And so now, technical excellence, what's that? Well, actually, good design is technical excellence, so I'm not sure what the distinction is supposed to be here. Anyway, I've got my alternative formulation, which became quite long, and I was able to find a shorter formulation. Required qualities must be quantified, so that's what we're doing. Each of these qualities is quantified. And supporting designs, so these are the supporting designs for reaching the qualities must be estimated. So here we're estimating how good the different designs are, and finally measured in place as they're incrementally delivered. So this is an engineering method of first estimating how good the technical design is, okay? And using that information to prioritize delivering the designs that give the most value for the least cost with the least risk. This is the method I use, okay? And then having implemented what we decided to prioritize and implement, we need to measure what really happened, as they do in IBM, clean room, and confirm it, and other good clients of ours, and decide whether we made bad estimates and need to do something like enhance the design or change the design, okay? So in other words, long story short, I'd move this to an engineering model, and here is my engineering model, which is thoroughly described in previous lectures and books and things like that. Principle 10, simplicity, the art of maximizing work not done. Well, that's very nice, sounds very sexy, thanks to the Little Prince and others. Here's my constructive reformulation. We need to learn and apply a wide variety of relevant methods, and simplification is one method. Okay, and there are many sub-methods of simplification. Here are some I would recommend, and I've written a lot about simplification. Fine, but there are methods that are not simplification and not related to simplification that we need to exploit in order to deliver the value within the constraints. Okay, so we can't just say that simplification is the art of the essential art. It's a good art. But it's one of many arts, and work not done is just one type of simplification. It's not the only type. So this is just dangerously oversimplified, like everything else, and we need to take a broader view. I mean, let's agree that delivering value, which is not mentioned here, is the essential idea, with a minimum of resources, another essential idea not mentioned, and that anything which helps us deliver the values within the resources is good, and that sometimes simplification is a good idea or set of ideas, and sometimes there are other ideas that, thousands of other ideas, by the way, which are good ones. So I talked about this in my 1st of April SPA lecture, which is videoed, the Technoscopes lecture. And in the Technoscopes book, which I think I gave a free copy of to everybody, there are 100 principles of reducing and dealing with complexity. Look it up. Principle number 11, by the way, we passed the hour mark, so this is time to, you should take a deep breath. If you're listening to the video, you should probably turn it off, get yourself a cup of tea, and refresh your mind so that you can tackle the next half of the thing. I will symbolically drink a glass of water or vodka, you will never know. And relax a little bit myself. So, principle 11. It says here, the best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. Now, what a load of poppycock. Number one, has anybody got some evidence or studies which are credible to support this at all? Send them to me, my email's there, okay? This is just something, now, for example, I would hope that the best architectures came from well-trained, top-skilled architects, not self-organizing teams of programmers who are not trained to do architecture. That's ridiculous, okay? I would hope that the best requirements came from very well-trained business analysts who were maybe doing requirements the way I think they should be done, quantified and very rich with information about the requirements. That's not something a self-organizing team of coders is trained to do or can do or will do. So that's ridiculous, okay? And designs, well, same remark. Now, I do know from the experiences at, for example, Confirm It, that the self-organizing team was very good at finding technical designs below the larger scale architecture. And they were programmers, but it turns out everybody on that team was also a qualified engineer from a first-class engineering university. So maybe the self-organizing teams might have engineering members who are capable of interesting design, in which case I do believe that self-organizing teams can find good designs, but maybe professional architectures ought to do the architecture, and coding teams are probably not the right place to do architecture. So this is, again, I don't know. We have to maybe look at it in the context of people doing it 20 years ago. I have rewritten the whole thing, but I've also got a simplified version, which we'll take the trouble to read here. We will use engineering quantification for all variable requirements and for all architecture. So symbolically, here's a picture of the quantified requirements for values, the quantified requirements for resources, and the quantification of how good the different architectures or designs, you can use this for both architecture level and detailed design level, are. In other words, an engineering discipline to think about these fairly complex interactions. If you have 10 values and 10 designs, you have 100 potential interactions there, plus the resource interactions, which could be another 10 or 20. So again, this stuff is not necessary for something a good coder can code in a week, but it is absolutely necessary for military systems, space systems, large government and large corporate systems, or they will fail on some level, like not delivering the values required, or excessive use of money or time to develop them, or lack of understanding of risks, which we're actually handling down here. Okay, so in other words, I'm recommending an engineering method for getting the best architectures, requirements, and designs. Principle 12. At regular intervals, the team reflects on how to become more effective and then tunes and adjusts its behavior accordingly. Okay, now at a small scale level, this is probably fine, and I don't necessarily disagree with it. But what if you have 1,000 people in 5-person teams spread across the globe? Now, actually, IBM has had this problem, and that's why they used and built the defect prevention process and used it on effectively thousands of programmers working on different things simultaneously. But the people writing this don't know what the defect prevention process is or how it works at all. They literally are, as far as I can understand, are thinking about people having sort of a stand-up meeting, like, what would you do differently? Now, how does that feed into actually changing the process of all the 4,000 people? And that's not clear. How you measure that the change you're thinking of works, and how you spread that change to 4,000 people spread across the globe. The defect prevention process has a recipe for doing this on a very large scale, and has proof that it works on a very large scale at companies like IBM, Raytheon, and others. I've used it at Boeing, for example, and it works there for 3,000 engineers. So I think simple reflection of the stand-up team type is insufficient for large scale, but I'll admit probably sufficient if you have only one team of 5 people, and then they maybe should reflect and change things. And then there's a question of how good they are at embedding the change, since they don't believe in having any formal bureaucracy, so that it persists after people have left the team and things like that. Well, we'll see. So I specifically say, if I were to rewrite this, I would bring in something like the defect prevention process, or other even better processes. If you know about them, please tell me if you do, because I don't know about any better ones. And in other words, but in the shorter version is incrementally engineer, because defect prevention process is an engineering culture, organizational effectiveness. So not people stand up reflecting and things like that. Here's some other more specific ideas, my 10 principles of improvement. There's detail on it here at this reference, okay? So again, as usual, oversimplified, child of its time, but dangerous, because I don't think it's as powerful as these much more specific ideas. So that's my attempt to constructively criticize the well-intended values and principles, which were written by a lot of very smart, good friends of mine, well-intended. The stuff was vague enough that everybody bought into it and did, in my view, precious little with it, except say, we believe in Agile, and Agile is maybe the principles and values, whatever that means. Here's another simplified rewrite, very short, from another time and place. But if you want really short versions of the values, there they are, and really short, well, fairly short versions of the principles, there they are there. Make your own. Now, we're ready for part 3. And part 3 was this, remember, tongue-in-cheek. I'm sort of advising saboteurs how to sabotage IT projects, and we don't seem to need a lot of help. You look up failed projects on the internet and get all kinds of stuff, but here are failed waterfall and agile projects. Small is generally good, and failed here means total failure, like never got on the air, total waste of money. But there's another interesting category that many people summarize these and say, well, maybe only 9% of agile projects totally failed, but 52% had their problems, like running over budget, running over time, delivering little quality, but we used it. Okay. Total success, meaning everything worked as it should. And again, I suspect these numbers are being a little on the high side, but what the heck? The point is, we are far away from failure, but there is an argument that with these numbers that Agile, and I think it's because it gives feedback, however bad that feedback is, but it gives feedback early and frequently and forces us to do some adjustment. Here's another look at it, different kinds of projects. But if you look at this thing here, which is about half of all projects are either total failure or partial failure. So we don't have a good track record. If bridge builders or heart surgeons had the same track record, I hope people would be up in arms saying that the bridge builders and the surgeons were totally incompetent and dangerous for society. Right now, since society has never had anything better going for it, they accept it as a natural truth. So if I wanted to sabotage projects or advise people how to do it, make sure you stick to customers and users and don't go into stakeholders and don't go into the wide variety of needs and values that stakeholders have. I use Jeff Bezos here because he does mention customers, but he does understand the notion of a very rich set of values that the customers have, and he does understand the idea of making it better day by day. So I still have respect for Jeff, even though he doesn't say stakeholders and he doesn't quite say values, he just says customer experience. Again, a dominant idea in conventional Agile is the user, as in use cases, user stories, user design, and fine for small scale, and certainly better we look at the user than not look at the user. But I'm afraid one reason for failure when we have guaranteeing failure is focusing on the users and the customers and not the other stakeholders. Very good examples of that are Google and Facebook, who didn't seem to recognize there was a stakeholder called the European Union with considerable power, not to mention the United States Congress with considerable power to power over them. And so they were very busy focusing on the Facebook customers, but not on the powers that be, who said you can't just violate privacy right, left, and center and allow the Russians to come in and change the election. So that was quite embarrassing for the leaders So they didn't really do good stakeholder analysis. Again, if you don't do good stakeholder analysis and you have powerful stakeholders who don't like what you're doing, they will get you sooner or later. But it's quite embarrassing to be there on international television saying, I'm sorry, we didn't mean to, we forgot that, we'll be better, as the leaders of these major corporations have had to be. The whole point of stakeholder analysis is to figure this out early before it becomes a scandal. And, in other words, this is not a world driven by programmers. It's a world driven by mature, knowledgeable business analysts. Where are they? They're out there, but there are not too many of them in IT. Okay, so if you want to sabotage a project, don't say stakeholder, say user, focus on use cases, user stories, user design, and I think you're guaranteed to have failure for all the other stakeholders who are not users. Okay. Now, by the same token, let's not clarify the stakeholder values, also known as requirements. Let's spout bullshit with nice sounding words all over the place. Here's an example. Here's an example of a person who thinks they're an expert on Agile, spouting bullshit right, left, and center about how good it is. And I'm afraid this is normal. If you were to count the number of ambiguous statements here, like proactively engage, we can just pick that out random. What does proactively mean? What does engage mean? What does even customers actually mean here? If you were to count all the ambiguous words that could stand better definition in this real set of requirements, what would you find? How much ambiguity? And I say, if you go through this as an exercise, you should find at least 50 words that could use better, clearer definition. And if you don't do it, somebody will define it or ignore it, and you'll get basically following bad or misunderstood requirements as the result. Time and time again, if you Google things like reasons why projects fail, you'll find number one on the list is bad communication about critical requirements, and you're looking at it right now. Now, we did a value requirements session, have a whole book on it, on how to write much better, much clearer requirements, so I refer you to that as a discipline I would recommend. Now, another thing you can do is to sabotage a project is this. Listen to all the nice sounding designs and strategies that the top managers recommend. Now, here's a real example of a real client of mine, a top manager, the CIO. By the way, he had about 2,000 IT personnel plus 2,000 contractors, let's say 4,000 people worldwide CIO. And he started a project which was in a big hurry. The one bank vision had to be done within the year. It was so critical. At the end of the year, I was called in and the project was in total failure mode and had spent $100 million. That's real money, in case you didn't notice. And I got the job of taking a look at it with the European CIO, Vince, who understood my methods. And we got a hold of the vision from the CIO, which is exactly this. Now, what I've done, I've gone through it and done a little exercise, a little practical trick. I've gone through it and I found what I call link words through by implementation of, supporting, etc. What do they link? They link ends and means. In other words, they say, I'm going to do A so that I get B, my objective. Okay. Now, the moment you have a link word, you have, by definition, not simply got requirements of what we're going to achieve. You've not simply got values. You have somebody's idea of strategies or technology or design to get the values. Notice also that the values, like business alignment, are not defined, not quantified. So here we have some vague ideas of good shit we should do in order to achieve some other vague management bullshit like business alignment. So the blind are leading the blind. The blind business analyst hasn't defined business alignment so that we can measure it, but it's obviously a top value of the CIO and probably the CEO. And then we jump to the technology level, managing critical initiatives on a portfolio basis, which probably has a million different interpretations. So in other words, bullshit leads to bullshit. Bullshit leads to bullshit all over the place. This, my friends, maybe you recognize it, is normal, okay, at the top level. This is what is called management bullshit. What we need to do is analyze this. We need to separate all the values, which could be at 2 or more levels, and we need to quantify and clarify those values so we know exactly what business alignment means and how we're going to measure that the business is getting more aligned, okay? And same with response to business changes, okay, etc. And then we need to find strategies which are floating around here. They could be good strategies for all I know, and estimate based on their track record in our bank or other banks or other similar companies, using an impact estimation table, estimate how good they are for delivering our quantified values, our more business alignment. And then if some of them look good based on the track record, we need to try them out week by week, step by step, and see if they really deliver measured business alignment. But so this is a disaster set in process by the CEO, who doesn't say, look, guys, I'm just thinking aloud. Would you please go and quantify all of my requirements and estimate how good all my strategic ideas are, and do them step by step in Agile and measure that we're getting them. The CIO that I worked with, Vince, in London, was a guy who did understand this stuff and did understand that his boss, Tom, was screwing up and commissioned me and him to work on these things and get them back on track, okay? But here's a perfect, now you find this, I find it everywhere, at the large scale IT level, management bullshit, a CIO not really managing the values, the requirements, and the engineering work of plugging in strategies and trying them out in Agile. Okay, so if you want to sabotage a large scale IT project to the tune of $100 million wasted in a single year, this is how you do it. Allow the CIO to spout bullshit and pass it on to IT people who don't do anything except let's start coding some of this shit and hope it works and hope we get paid for it. Another way of sabotaging projects is to pick the most popular in techniques that everybody's doing. Could be, for example, safe in Agile, or some type of design which is very popular. Buy their training, get certified in them, and do all the popular stuff. And referring to the fact that the methods are used by Toyota or Google, and therefore they must be good methods. We don't have to prove that they work delivering our values. Okay, so in other words, choosing popular methods. It's amazing how many people choose methods and justify them as they are popular at large successful corporations, therefore we're also going to do them. Agile itself is one of the biggest bad ideas that people have chosen because it became popular in large corporations. Okay, so if I want to sabotage things, let's find out what is the most popular thing going and then adopt it. And I think, see, what happens is small minds like to choose popular methods so they can blame the failure on other people and corporations. And therefore, if the small minds of your corporation have chosen something because it's popular, it's bound to be a way of sabotaging your projects and failure. What you need are methods that measurably deliver your corporate values regularly whatever they are, and even if they're not popular anywhere except in your project on your corporation. Do you hear what I'm saying? Is that an idea that could become popular? That we use methods that work on our project to deliver our specific, tailored values for our specific, special stakeholders. Another thing I'd recommend you do if you want to fail in your projects is don't ever pull up a table like an impact estimation table and take all the various technologies and estimate how good they are for the different things. This is actually a real example from research done by a lot of first-class universities, ultimately for the Obama White House on artificial intelligence. I've got some papers on that. And they had all these technological ideas which they were touting, and then they were supposed to be good for all of these qualities of artificial intelligence, which they had not quantified, and they never bothered to estimate how good their technologies were. So of course they move into failure mode with just a lot of assertions that our UC Berkeley artificial intelligence method's very good, and UCLA said no, our strategy is good because we're from UCLA, but nobody ever bothers to say let's estimate how good it is based on evidence and fact and research from our research institution. Okay, so in other words, don't bother to systematically analyze how good technologies are based on facts and experience for reaching the set of values which you probably haven't bothered to quantify. Okay, you're guaranteed that people will do something. The UCLA people will use the UCLA method, and the UC Berkeley people will use the UC Berkeley method, and they will probably all fail and declare themselves to be a scientific success in finding out which artificial intelligence methods did not work yet. That's called science, by the way. Okay. In other words, don't systematically analyze your techniques and strategies. Just jump in because they're popular or people know how to do them or they're local. And at the same time, a lot of people focus on the primary effects of a technology, like poverty techniques to end poverty. But it may turn out that these end poverty strategies might have nasty side effects. Here's minus 42% side effect on healthy lives. Long story short, a good engineering practice is to find nasty side effects from what you do before committing to something, no matter how good it is on the in the primary area for which it has been selected. So again, don't encourage side effect analysis like a good engineer. Just go for something that's good in its primary effect, and to heck with side effects, let them happen and blame somebody else or just say it's a complex system. That's a good way of sabotaging systems. Now, we certainly don't want to use what I call no cure, no pay contracting. Step by step, making a deal that if you deliver this set of measurable values, we'll pay you a certain amount of money. No, fixed price contract, and then you can do all the agile you want here and write all the code you want. And at the end of it, we'll have a failed project. For example, at the Norwegian Social Security Administration, we spent about 6 years using Agile, totally failed project, about 6 billion kroner, considerably over budget, and the parliament had to fire the minister and the CIO and try to get back on track. I'm afraid that same institution is still doing Agile and not focusing on value. So I've already predicted that they're going to fail again and just say, but we were doing Agile in a much better way than the way we did the first failed project. Sad stuff. Okay, so now if we did no pay, no cure contracting, we would quickly find out which contractors could deliver value and get rid of contractors that could not do it and motivate contract to deliver us value. But I remember talking to one UK civil service institution about doing this, and I said, doesn't this sound like a good idea? And their only remark was, that's not the way we do it in British civil service. End of discussion. You know, forget how good common sense it would be to save taxpayers money. Okay, so in other words, very dangerous stuff. Only pay when people give value. If we make sure we don't do that, then we have a good chance of failing and sabotaging projects. Now, I'm pretty much finished with that. The project saboteur, the one intent on sabotaging, say, the democratic election in the United States, they may be resident in Moscow, I don't know. We hardly need lift a finger to ensure project failures, because project failures, total or partial, are more than half of what people do almost all the time. The failure rate is high and stable over decades before Agile, and a little bit better with Agile, but not much, and certainly nowhere near zero defect project failure, which has been achieved by, for example, Confirmit or IBM Federal Systems Division with the methods I'm talking about. Now, I mentioned a lot of people use methods because they are popular with major corporations. So if they don't work, you can blame them. And now, is it possible, we know that certain Russian secret agents are actively trying to sabotage democratic processes and people in both Britain and the US, but surely there's no active conspiracy to make us fail with our IT projects. And I didn't used to think so. I used to think people were stupid or greedy, but not that they stealthily fed us the wrong information so we'd fail. But then I came across the help of my friend Łukasz Stotek in Poland recently. This fellow here, nice fellow, father of the Toyota production system, credited by people like Jess Sutherland with part of his inspiration for Scrum. And but in this book, he admits something hair-raising. He admits to consciously hiding the truth about the lean methods to Americans and European visitors, doing his best to confuse them as to why Toyota was so successful. And he would talk about things like Kanban. Recognize that, guys? Part of our Agile kit. And Kaizen, that actually is evolutionary incremental improvement. I did my best to prevent visitors from fully grasping our overall approach. This is amazing. This means just because a successful corporation is using some methods, and just because we have got the recipe, it doesn't mean it's not a false recipe, and it doesn't mean that our competitors, read, for example, China today, are not lying through their teeth in order to destroy Western civilization and IT, because this guy was doing it. Okay, here we have my good friend Jeff, very specifically referring to the same Ono. Unfortunately, Jeff also refers to Gilb, so you never know what to believe these days. Don't do my methods just because I recommend them. Measure that they work for you. Then you will know whether they're good enough for you, if not. Here's a little bit of fun. If anything can go wrong, it will. The saboteur's guideline, and we all know about Murphy's law. And here's some other laws and some nice papers on the subject. So there's plenty to help the saboteur sabotage. And mainly, it turns out, just leaving IT people to their own devices, getting false information, choosing popular methods, forgetting to use engineering methods and scientific process. That still guarantees we're going to have a much larger than near zero project failure rate. The ideal is zero project failure rate. It is attainable and has been attainable for years using the methods I'm talking about. So why in the world can't we, at least the sensible ones of you, start going for proving and documenting and holding a talk at British Computer Society about 5 years of zero defect failure of projects using whatever techniques you arrive at. So, got 24 minutes left, little breather, little pause, and I've got my part 4 is, okay, I've bashed everything and everybody else. I have tried to be constructive and say how I would rewrite the Agile Manifesto, for example. What is really Agile as I would have it? So I make an artificial separation. I've got pseudo-Agile, which are largely what I call generic frameworks. Here are some books on them. And I've got real Agile, the one I believe in. Let's take a rough look through it. First, I find that the pseudo-Agile is very much a belief culture. You are told what to do to get your certificate. You are told what to practice. You are not given any evidence, any science on how to measure it, how it's been measured, or how you can measure whether that culture you've learned to get your certification is any good. They never talk about quality measures of anything, maybe a little bit of not too many bugs, but that's not really what I mean by quality measure. I mean things like maintainability, usability, security, things like that. No cost measures. For example, the cost of maintaining the systems would be interesting, also known as technical debt. The culture is definitely a craft culture. I call these people soft crafters. They do what they're told. They do what their father and grandfather did, and it is not to be questioned. And that's the way we do things. And by the way, it works on a smaller scale, or at least the errors are somehow mystically corrected in the sprints and by good people. The problem is when we scale up and go for skyscrapers. So it is, above all, a small scale culture, as all the people who tried to scale up Scrum and other things quickly found out. And it's a programming culture. It's not an IT culture, meaning a culture of delivering good value with the help of IT hardware, databases, people, and other things except code. And it fails far too often, as you can find out just by Googling it. So that's the bad boy. Here are the books on it, written by some very good people who mean well and believe in what I think they believe in what they're saying. Although I talked to one person teaching Scrum masters who will remain anonymous, I said, if you truly understand how bad that stuff is, why do you teach it? And he said, Tom, I earn a shitload of money that way because people keep on paying for it. And I have big debts I have to pay, so that's why I do it. In other words, some of your teachers do it not because they believe in what they're teaching, because you're foolish enough to pay them good money to get your certificate and post it on LinkedIn and be proud of it. How silly do we get? Real Agile, Agile as it should be, which is an engineering technology, has the following characteristics: that it's focused on delivering stakeholder value. Okay, as early as my software metrics book in '76, my software engineering management book in '88, clearly in detail focused on delivering multiple values simultaneously. It's very, very cost effective. That is, it's interested in the values, but with regard to costs, both short-term, long-term, time, people, money, and not least including technical debt and the long-term operational costs of things. And it explicitly includes these ideas in its thinking process, even in the first week of planning. It's based on systems, not code. Now, something like SAFe has decided to be very clear about the fact that it's systems, not code. Good for them. These methods are scale-free. That is, they actually work at any scale. This has been proven extensively. I've got some slides on it from Intel. They work on the largest imaginable known projects, and they work on pretty small beans, small-scale projects. They are engineering methods, no doubt about it, not craft. They are fact-based, incremental, feedback-driven, which is one of the really of the ideals of Agile. And they, above all, say that successful value delivery is what it's all about. So, are you doing this? Have fun. And when you get tired of failing, try something else. But you should be able to prove and measure that this works better right away from the second week and on, if you, as my own disciples, which I'll tell you about, do. Working at a bank in the UK for the board of directors that had decided to make the whole bank agile, not just IT, we were commissioned to give them a little bit of advice, and in that connection, I defined Agile this way. Agile is the Agile process is any set of tactics, any set of methods or processes that enable a prioritized, in other words, good shit first, stream regularly of useful, valued results in spite of a changing environment. In other words, Agile is when bad shit hits the fan, you can do something about it immediately. I like this definition of Agile and would like you to consider sharing it with me. Unfortunately, most people have the definition at the level of the Agile process as defined, for example, by Scrum, and I don't think that's what it's about at all, but that unfortunately is the most common way of doing it. My good friend Craig Larman, when we years ago were discussing what is Agile, he said, Tom, Agile is the Agile Manifesto. And that's one way of defining it, but as I just told you, I don't think that's a very good way of defining it. Here's another look at really the same things. Traditional Agile's very focused on this, iteration of delivering code. The value Agile model, real Agile, which we often call EVO for evolutionary value optimization, is this cycle, and it's an engineering cycle, it's a quantified cycle, and it's a systems engineering cycle. So stakeholder value delivery is the real point. Isn't that simple? What, on your projects, how much value did you measure at the last cycle that you delivered that some of your critical stakeholders are really interested in and is really prioritized? What are your bragging rights about value delivery? Okay. Now, if some form of Agile, and there are many, including my own, can make that stakeholder delivery better and faster, good. Use it as long as it works. But the point is the stakeholder value delivery, not Agile religious cults. Now, if time were out, and it's not, we got a quarter of an hour left, I said we could stop here. Here are some free books. This is the series. So you all more or less know how to get a free copy of these books. They're all free for the moment. Share them with friends and share the videos and the slides. Here's a set of books that we're selling on our website. Maybe my next series will be on life design and value planning, innovative creativity, clear communication, and 100 practical planning principles. We can talk about that, Imo, when you're ready. So those are the textbooks for that. But these also are much more detailed. This one here, value planning, is 700 pages. All of these I tried to get down to the booklet level, 100, maximum 200 pages. So these are the short, simple ones for people who don't believe in long texts, even though they can't then figure out how to do things properly. Okay. This one, value planning, is the text for those who want to be top experts in the world in using the most advanced Agile techniques in the world. But it's 700 pages. It's a brain dump of everything I've learned in about 50 or 60 years. in detail the practices. Here's a nice little one-page summary, and maybe go through a few of these in our next 14 minutes. My principles, okay? It is the critical stakeholders. Those are the ones who can shut you down or make you a success. They determine the values you must manage, the requirements you need to specify, okay? So who can shut you down? Can the European Union still shut you down because of privacy violations after Brexit? And if you don't know that they can, and you say, no problem, Brexit, rid of the European Union, you're kidding yourself. USA is not in the European Union, but the US multinationals have had to kowtow to the European Union, paying large fines, being embarrassed in public. So find out who your critical stakeholders are. They make laws. They pay a lot of money, but they're not necessarily your customer for something, etc. Okay. Now, principle number 2. The critical stakeholder values that the critical stakeholders want can be quantified, always, no exception. And they must be quantified if we're going to get control of the problem. And this quantified values is the key technical idea that moves us into engineering, into being serious, into having a method for handling large-scale, long-term IT projects. Now, okay, I could use the rest of the time on that, but I gave you a start on it. And you'll find that this is, in a way, just a summary of everything I say every time I open my mouth and put a slide on there. Okay. Now, second point, at one point, I was looking at SAFe and other methods of scaling up Agile, and I didn't like them. I was not impressed at all, not least because they don't quantify values. They just say value and actually mean financial value savings in the conventional. They don't mean usability, security, or anything like that. So I was just not impressed. And so I began to write a paper on how my methods can be used for extremely large scale. And this is the paper. And then I began writing down some principles with reference to my books about what we did to make things work on large scale. There's the value planning book, free copy, okay? And I began even trying to explain roughly why it happened. For example, no matter how big or large a project is, whether it be thousands of people or 3 people, I can still have one-page top-level results controlling any level of complexity in a black box under it. And that's a simple explanation of why this top level of value control allows us to control at any scale. The world's largest project, which could be the UN Sustainability Goals project, has 18 goals at the top level, for example. I also took the trouble of quantifying what I mean by scale free in terms of quantifiable objectives, some of which you'll find in detail in my competitive engineering book. How do you quantify maintainability and usability and portability? And some of the other ones are in the scalability metrics talk, which is right here. In other words, can you quantify the multiple dimensions of scalability in order to deal with it in a mature way? Here's my attempt to show you a pattern for how that might be done. I then sent my paper to my dear friend Eric Simmons at Intel, who spent 20 years of his life spreading the competitive engineering methods to over 20,000 engineers at Intel. And he shocked me a little bit. He said, Tom, you do not have methods that scale up. And when I first heard that, I was really unhappy. I thought I knew it worked on very big systems because I'd done them, but I do respect Eric and what he says. But then he had a sort of a second sentence. Your methods don't need to scale up. They work at any scale, large or small systems. This is what he wrote. And I thought, whew. And he said, we have proven this on extremely large and extremely small projects at Intel, there's no doubt whatsoever your methods work at any scale. So why should you pick Scrum? Use it for small projects, then you have a gigantic projects, then you have to go to SAFe, and you have to use a totally different method. If you like one method that works at all scales, I just happen to have a free copy of the method book, Competitive Engineering. Why don't you take a look at it, and why don't you take a closer look at why it actually scales up and down or is scale free. I know at the beginning I mentioned my Agile Startup Week, and I'd like to go into a little bit more detail about it while I still have 9 minutes left. So this is the way I start all my Agile projects, okay? Just for fun, I decided to retitle it the Planning Optimization Week, because then I could use the comic book acronym POW, okay? And it works this way. On the first day, we quantify the critical value. So that's what practically nobody else does or takes seriously, but we do it in one day, and done it on both large and small projects. Then Tuesday, we draft the best architecture or designs we think will reach the values. We do that on a page, on a day. Then on the third day, we build a table to see if these designs largely impact the values well enough. In other words, we have sufficient architecture to get there at a sufficient cost. And then we, on Thursday, decompose primarily the architecture to small enough steps that we can deliver them in an agile way, step by step and incrementally. And then Friday, we try to get approval from the boss to go ahead and do this radical new agile method, okay? So here's a little bit more. Here's a list of why we do these various things. The weekly sprint also follows this cycle. So this is the Gilb Evo cycle, and we've been through that before, but it's based on quantifying the numeric goals from the stakeholders. It's based on systematic decomposition using, for example, 20 principles of decomposition written up in the competitive engineering book. And it's based on deliver incrementally and measure the values delivered, measure the costs, learning about negative deviation and changing things, and continuing this process until all critical value targets are met, by which time, of course, the competitor will have upped the game, and you'll have to continue this forever, as I said, Deming does, okay? Here's, given my timing, just for fun, point out my very favorite example of doing this is Tesla car development, where Musk delivers on average 20 incremental changes to the automobile every week, half of which are software and can be downloaded by any vehicle owner, and half of which are hardware, but they go into the production facility. So you essentially have to buy a new car to get those, but they're not done on an annual basis with the annual model. They're done, the hardware changes in production are done on a weekly basis. This is unique in the history of large-scale production, but it's a great example of what I'm talking about. I would say it's identical to my own methods, and I'd like to think I taught Elon Musk to be a genius, but I have a suspicion he used his own intelligence and common sense to figure out these methods, just like Leonardo da Vinci and any other genius would have done. Okay. I learned another thing like to point out, that an awful lot of IT projects start off by building completely new hardware, software. And what I found in my over 50 years of practice is that is always a bad idea, never a good idea, even if you are going to radically change the nature of the system. I still think your best bet is to deliver small increments to the awful old system and watch it disappear step by step until the great new system with new hardware and new software emerges in time. And there's, I found that always is the best, safest way. And that's in the agile way of delivering a system. Building a system agile from scratch over 6 years before any delivery is really a stupid way of, well, failing, as in the Norwegian social security system, NAF, that I mentioned. There's a very popular silly new method called design sprint, and the startup week is my variation on it. That is, they believe in using about a week to get started, but they don't quantify anything. They don't have any experience you can find on the web or in the book. Here's the book. J.C. Penney, I think, was cited in the book. They filed for bankruptcy this week, by the way, and no data on how design sprint have. But it's amazing how popular this oversimplified method actually is, with all these bad characteristics, just like Scrum. And there is an option, and it's this one, where we do have a startup week, but it's based on an engineering paradigm. Now, more detail there, and far more detail there, but we've now run out of time. So I'll move towards the end slide. Here it is. You'll find all the slides there right now, almost 99.9% up to date. I did a few changes before I put them up there today. If you want the versions with, in order to get the presenter notes with PowerPoint, etc., there's some pretty interesting notes. You want to go to the PowerPoint or Keynote copy at this site. The Value Agile book right there, and videos of all previous, and within, it varies, but no later than 2 weeks, hopefully much earlier, we'll have a video up there of this talk. And do spread all of these things to your friends and to your enemies. Don't bother spreading them to people who have a religious cult belief in Agile. You're just wasting your time. We need to spread this to go-ahead, young, intelligent engineers who want to find a way of succeeding in their careers, getting a job when there are no other jobs to get. One man who's listening to this right now, Terje Moghus, called me up on the telephone and said, Tom, in the midst of the coronavirus, I got a job for a really big project, and I got the job because I use your methods. This is in UK. Maybe Terje tomorrow will give me the details. So I'm teaching you a way of distinguishing yourself from the masses of cult followers who fail. And it's going to take a lot of courage, tenacity, and patience to change any culture. But I've given you the recipe, more than enough practical, real case studies from named corporations. And all I'm asking is you go out and try it one small increment at a time and prove to yourself whether it works or not. And if my methods don't work, you probably misunderstood them, but dump what you're doing. And if they do work, hopefully you'll continue, increment, and be as successful as a guy like Eric Simmons, who changed the 20,000 engineers at Intel and their practices for 20 years. Isn't that a great claim to fame? And I've got several others of those amongst my heroes and champions at large corporations. Imagine if we could change the civil service and the UK government's way of doing things. So thank you very much. Bingo, exactly on time. I'll leave this up and I'm open for questions as usual.
Tom, I'd like to thank you on behalf of SPA and the Quality Group. This has been a most interesting presentation. I'm just going to stop the recording now.